The morning light filtering through the tall windows of Buckingham Palace did little to warm the tense atmosphere in the private study. King Charles III sat behind the mahogany desk that had belonged to his great-grandfather, his fingers steepled as he listened to Sir Michael Stevens, the keeper of the privy purse. The man responsible for the royal finances was not one for alarmism, which made the gravity of his current report all the more unsettling. He spoke in low, measured tones about a routine internal audit that had unearthed something far from routine. For months, the palace had been bracing for the continued fallout from the Prince Andrew situation, with new Epstein documents surfacing and bringing fresh waves of public scrutiny. But this was different. And this was not about the mistakes of the past or the scandals of a disgraced brother. This was about a present-tense breach of trust from within the walls of the family itself. The numbers on the paper before the king told a story of quiet, systematic bleeding. Funds from a specific charitable initiative, one the king had championed for decades focused on youth opportunity in the Commonwealth, had been subtly redirected. The amounts were not so large as to scream for attention, but over a period of 18 months, they painted a picture of deliberate deception. The forensic accountants Sir Michael had brought in followed the digital trail, a path that wound through shell companies and ended at a private gallery in Chelsea, a gallery managed by Lopes. The king felt a dull, heavy thud in his chest. Laura, his wife Queen Camilla's daughter from her first marriage, was family. She was not a working royal, but she was part of the fabric of their lives, a presence at private family gatherings, and a link to the world he had stepped into when he married Camilla. To see her name connected to this was not just a financial crime, it was a personal devastation. The implications were a minefield. Camilla would be shattered. The public, already weary of royal financial scandals, would see this as further proof of an entitled institution circling its wagons. The tabloids, which had recently been focused on the duchy's commercial dealings with the NHS and the Ministry of Defense, would have a field day with a story this intimate and damning. Charles looked out the window at the gray London sky, and the weight of the crown feeling heavier than it ever had. This was not a problem that could be managed with press releases and strategic briefings. This was a test of his kingship. He thought of his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and her belief in the institution above all else. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that there could be no half measures. To protect the monarchy, he had to excise this threat, no matter how close to home it struck. He looked back at Sir Michael and gave a single, sharp nod. The machinery of royal consequence began to turn, its target one of his own stepchildren. The investigation continued in absolute secrecy for another fortnight. The king's private legal team, working in tandem with the audit office, built an airtight case. They traced the funds not just to Laura's gallery, but to payments made for personal debts, a substantial renovation of a country home, the settlement of a quiet tax lien. It was a portrait of a life lived beyond its means, propped up by money that was never hers. When the king was presented with the final incontrovertible file, he felt a profound sense of betrayal, not just for the institution, but for the woman he loved. He had to tell Camilla. The conversation in their private quarters at Clarence House was agonizing. He showed her the evidence, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying his pain. Camilla sat in stunned silence, her face pale. The initial shock gave way to a storm of disbelief, anger, and a deep maternal anguish. She wanted to defend her daughter, to find a mistake, a misunderstanding. But the numbers and the dates were irrefutable, and the proof of her daughter's actions lay on the coffee table between them like a poisoned chalice. Charles held her hand, explaining that there was no other path. The police had not yet been called, but the internal verdict was passed. Laura could no longer be part of their world. The protection and privilege afforded to the family were gone. As Camilla wept, King Charles made the final decision. Laura Lopes was to be removed, not just from any association with the royal household, but from the inner sanctum of their family life. The next step was delivering that message. The reckoning. The summons to a private meeting at a discreet location in London, away from the prying eyes of the palace, came as a shock to Laura Lopes. She had gone about her business, managing her art gallery and navigating the social circles of London, largely removed from the day-to-day machinery of royal life. She was Camilla's daughter, a part of the king's extended family, but she was not a working royal and considered herself independent of the firm's rigid protocols. The request for a meeting, however, came directly from the king's private secretary, and its tone allowed for no refusal. As she sat in the back of a taxi, she felt a flutter of unease, a sense that something was very wrong, though she tried to rationalize it away as yet another family discussion about the ongoing Andrew saga or the latest tabloid intrusion. She was ushered into a quiet, wood-paneled room where the king's most senior legal advisor and Sir Michael Stevens awaited her. There were no warm smiles, no inquiries about her children or her gallery. The atmosphere was clinical, heavy with unspoken accusation. Sir Michael slid a thick folder across the table towards her. For the next hour, they walked her through the evidence with the cold precision of barristers in a courtroom. They showed her the bank statements, the flagged transactions, the digital signatures that linked her gallery's accounts to the missing charitable funds. They spoke of forensic trails and shell companies, their words washing over her in a wave of disbelief and mounting horror. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an execution. They laid bare the secret she had kept buried for over a year, the desperate financial scramble, the quiet siphoned funds she had convinced herself were a temporary loan from a vast uncaring institution, a loan she would someday repay. Her initial denials, weak and stumbling, were met with the same impassive expressions. Then her attempts to explain were silenced by the sheer weight of documentary proof. The men across the table explained the legal reality. This was theft, plain and simple. The only question was how it would be handled. They made it clear that the decision rested solely with the king. He had been briefed on every detail. He knew the extent of the betrayal. Laura felt the world tilt on its axis. The man who had married her mother, who had been a presence in her life for decades, the King of England, knew she was a thief. The meeting ended as abruptly as it began. She was told to return home and await further instruction. No charges were filed, yet. The door closed behind her, leaving her alone in the corridor, the weight of her ruined life pressing down on her shoulders. Days passed in a torturous limbo. She barely slept, jumping at every phone notification. Her mother did not call. The silence from the family was more terrifying than any screaming match could have been. Then, a formal letter arrived on heavy embossed paper. It was from the king's solicitors. It was not a legal indictment, but it was a definitive, final judgment. It outlined, in stark legalese, her permanent removal from any and all associations with the royal household. She was no longer welcome at any royal residence, be it Sandringham, Balmoral, or Highgrove. Her name was struck from the guest lists for any state or family function. All financial and logistical support from the household was terminated immediately. The letter was a decree of banishment. It was the king, publicly, though privately, severing the bond. He was not just firing an employee, he was erasing her from his world. And for Camilla, the days following Laura's confrontation were a private hell. The queen consort was torn between the unconditional love of a mother and the duty she owed to her husband and the crown. She watched Charles wrestle with the decision, saw the toll it took on him, and knew that his choice, while brutal, was the only one a monarch could make. Laura was her daughter, the little girl she had raised, the woman she was so proud of. But the evidence was a chasm between them that could not be bridged. When Camilla finally spoke to Laura on the phone, her voice was not that of a queen, but of a heartbroken mother. There were no angry accusations, only a profound, tearful sorrow. She told Laura that she loved her, that she would always love her, but that trust, once broken by such a staggering act of disloyalty, could not be mended with a simple apology. The door to the family, the royal family, was closed. Their relationship would now exist in the private shadows, forever altered, a silent wound that would never fully heal. Laura was left to sit in her empty London home, the letter in her hand, the phone line dead, the full cold reality of her exile settling in. The fallout. The story, as stories of royal disgrace always do, found its way into the public domain. It did not come from the palace, which maintained a stoic, silent front, but from a dogged financial journalist who had been tipped off by a source close to the investigation. The initial headline was explosive: King severs ties with stepdaughter over funds misappropriation. The internet erupted. Social media platforms became a battlefield of opinions. With hashtags like #RoyalTheft and #Queen Camilla's daughter trending worldwide. The tabloids, particularly those with a history of Republican leanings, went into a frenzy. They plastered their front pages with pictures of Laura Lopes digging through her past, her fashion choices, her marriage, her gallery's financial history. They painted her as the epitome of aristocratic entitlement, a woman who felt the rules didn't apply to her. The story was a gift to them, a perfect storm of family drama, financial scandal, and the mystique of the monarchy. The timing could not have been worse for the palace. The investigation into Prince Andrew's affairs was still simmering, with periodic releases of court documents keeping his association with Jeffrey Epstein in the news. Furthermore, the recent bombshell documentary, The King, So the Prince and Their Secret Millions, had only just begun to fade from the public consciousness. That investigation had revealed the vast, tax-efficient commercial empires of the duchies of Lancaster and Cornwall, showing how the King and Prince William profited from leases with the NHS, the Ministry of Defense, and even charities. Critics like Dame Margaret Hodge and Sir Edward Lee had already called for a review of the duchy's tax status, arguing that it was unfair for the royals to operate as commercial landlords while being exempt from corporation and capital gains tax. Now, this new scandal added a layer of personal venality to the existing narrative of institutional privilege. The public, already questioning the family's financial ethics, saw the Laura Lopes affair as further proof of a rotten system. Within the palace, the communications team was in crisis mode. They could not deny the story, but they were determined to control the narrative. Their strategy was twofold. First, to emphasize the king's swift and decisive action, portraying him not as a complicit party, but as a strong modern monarch who would root out wrongdoing even within his own family. Anonymous briefings from senior royal aides stressed the king's sorrow but also his absolute commitment to integrity and transparency. The second prong of the strategy was to completely isolate Laura, making her the sole villain of the piece. They fed background information to favored journalists, painting a picture of a troubled figure living beyond her means, whose actions had left the king with no choice. They were careful not to comment on the specifics of the case, citing privacy, but the implication was clear. This was Laura's crime, and the king was the one who